Meh, meh, meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, meh, meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, meh, meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh, meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, meh, meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, meh, meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh, 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 meh. Meh.
Taking a moment to briefly survey their surroundings, Commander Gardner began barking out orders to set up the basics they would need to survive. As the crew jumped to action, Gardner took a moment to consider their skills and the best place to allocate their efforts. Kelsier Luthadel. Growing up in a war zone, Kelsier was an extra pair of hands to her parents, who were medical personnel on the front lines. She learned a lot about medicine from them, but the use of incendiary devices throughout the war left her terrified of fire. Following the end of the war, she turned her talents to ranging, surviving off the land while out on long journeys to forge supplies for her parents' work. She signed up to join the rebellion out of revenge, hoping to make the Empire pay for all the suffering her people had endured during the war on her home planet. Kelsier was brave as hell, and had a deep understanding of local fauna. Her skills would be put to good use cultivating food for them to eat. Gaius Tavi Octavian. Born on a planet already on the brink of destruction due to climate change, Tavi and his parents did whatever they needed to survive. This eventually led to them signing on with a passing mercenary crew, more as a way off the planet than out of desire for the work. Tavi, however, took to the life quite well, and eventually struck out on his own, his charm allowing him to win contracts that rougher mercenaries wouldn't be able to obtain. While working a contract as armed guard for a prison transport, he was subject to a rebel ambush as they attempted to rescue their comrades. With some quick thinking, Tavi managed to convince the rebels to let him join them in exchange for his life. He would be an effective guard against any of the locals while they tried to build the ship. Brom Holcomson. Brom had a poor start to life, growing up as a slave on a Rimworld which had not advanced beyond medieval technology. Following a successful escape plan by a number of the slaves, Brom and her family went into hiding deep in the mountains, logging the nearby forests for a living. Brom got involved with the rebellion after her home and the forests they earned a living from were set ablaze by the careless landing of an Imperial starship. The nobleman in charge of the starship refused to reimburse them, so Brom sought out her own source of justice. Living off the grid taught Brom a lot about how to build things that last. She would be a great candidate for taking the lead on construction of their temporary base. Terciel and Celestieri. Growing up orphaned on a sprawling hub-world city, Terciel had been looked after by a crime syndicate in return for him acting as their spy on the streets. As he grew, his physical size lent itself well to intimidation, so the syndicate had him working in a butcher shop that they used as a front, in order to quell any objections from their clientele. Terciel had thought that the syndicate had valued him, but as he got older he began to understand how they used coercion and trickery to get people to work for them. When he overheard someone recruiting for the rebellion in the pub one night, he risked it all to escape and get out from under the syndicate's thumb. His time in the city had made him tough and given him insight into one of its major exports, minerals. He would be able to turn that knowledge to their advantage, extracting minerals from the nearby deposits to fuel their attempts to build a ship. And finally, Commander Richard Gardner himself. Gardner was raised and trained by Pathfinders, explorers who charted new systems and knew every path through the galaxy there was to know. Following the destruction of one of their ships due to a perceived slight against an Imperial house, Gardner and the Pathfinder swore vengeance and took up with the rebellion. His experience with the Pathfinders allowed him to navigate the systems without ever being spotted, earning him a reputation for incredibly fast hit-and-run attacks on Imperial convoys, starving them of their supplies and earning him command of the rebel ship, the Arctis Tor. Although he was no engineer, his knowledge of spacecraft was great. He would take the lead on ensuring that they fully understood how to create a ship. With this in mind, Gardner began to list out the things that they would need. In the first instance, to survive long enough to complete the construction of the ship, they would need food, shelter, and security measures. He would have preferred that their presence on the planet remained a mystery to the locals, however they would surely have seen the drop pods enter the atmosphere, and natives were not often friendly to outsiders. Following this, he began to list the parts that every ship would need. Life support systems to provide water and oxygen, a command console from which to pilot it, engines to achieve orbit, sensors to aid the pilot in avoiding the space junk, power generation to keep the heat on and the oxygen flowing, room for the crew to live until they could make landfall on new planets, and an airtight hull would probably be quite helpful. With a rough plan set out, Gardner went to see how the shelter was coming along. The crew had repurposed some old ruins they had landed near for their initial shelter. They patched up a few holes in the walls, and planned out a small extension to allow for additional storage. For the time being, this large room would house everything they need, from their beds to their dining room to their kitchen. They hadn't been on the ground long, but Tavi was feeling particularly naked without a weapon, so he requested that Tarsiel put his skills to use to craft him a bow. The commander overheard this and recommended that Tarsiel make one for each of the crew, to make sure they were prepared for any hostilities. He also suggested that once Tavi had his bow, he could put it to good use by hunting some of the local wildlife for them to eat. In order to keep progress moving quickly, it was vital that they set up a power supply as soon as they could. The crew began by building a solar panel to the rear of the shelter. One should suffice for now, just enough to keep the lights on and hopefully power a bench for the commander to begin his research. They were aware of how little they knew about building a spaceship, so had a good idea of how important it was to start learning as soon as possible. They were on a bit of a time crunch after all. Along with the shelter, the commander also designated an area to serve as the group's latrine. Brom raised some objections, stating that they should just relieve themselves in the sea to spare themselves the mess. However, the commander mentioned that he had heard that the waste they produced could be broken down into biofuel. It wouldn't be pretty, but it might just end up being what powered the ship's engines. With a groan of disgust, the crew agreed to start stockpiling their waste. The crew was a bustle of activity. Kelsier was planting fields of corn, cotton, and herbal medicine out front, and had found a particularly fertile patch of soil to the south in which to grow rice. Tarsiel was crafting bows out of the newly felled timber, Tavi was out hunting for dinner, Brom was constructing the furniture and the walls of the shelter, and the commander? Well, the commander was deep in thought. Although the commander still lacked a workbench, he contemplated what he would research first once it was available. Immediately, he landed on trying to understand deep drills and ground-penetrating scanners. There was not an abundance of minerals on the surface for them to use, and he knew they would need to search below ground for more to complete their build. The quicker he got a scanner up and running, the more time it would have to find them what they need. Tarsiel took a break from making the bows for the group in order to liberate some components from a nearby rock face. These components would be necessary for the solar panel and any other electrical goods they needed. By the end of the day, only 2 beds had been completed and the shelter was still a bit of a patchwork of construction, but no one could expect much more for having just landed on the planet with nothing to their name. Tavi's first kill was soon ready, an ibex ram which Kelsier would use to break in their new butcher stable. By midday on the second day, the commander finished securing the door to the shelter, allowing them to roof it and declare it a home. Whether by the commander's show of leadership and courage, or by virtue of not expecting that they have much time left alive, emotions were running high, to the commander and Brom's advantage. For Brom, being mocked about her ability to handle animals was the key to unlocking her heart, and she and the commander began a relationship. I guess people like what they like. Realising that they would likely be reliant on hunting for their food until the first harvest rolled in, Kelsier suggested to the crew that they build a freezer big enough to store the meat that they collected without fear of it going bad. The commander agreed and began sketching out a walk-in freezer attached to the shelter. The addition of the freezer meant that with just one additional wall they could create more storage space, whilst also providing a convenient path to the latrine. So they took advantage of this and erected another wall which they could line with shelves. As the third day drew to a close, they each had a bed laid out for them in the shelter. However, given the commander and Brom's new relationship, they were hoping for a bit more privacy than a shared room could offer them. The commander decided it would likely be best for everyone's continued happiness if they each had their own space in the colony, and set to laying out a row of rooms across the fields from the shelter. It would take more time and effort than having them all simply share a room, but in such a dire situation it was also important to keep morale as high as possible to ensure that everyone was working at full efficiency to get them off this rock. For tonight, however, the shared shelter would have to suffice. Given that Brom is the primary constructor and the one with the most to gain from having a room with a double bed, she made a quick start in the new residences the next day. They would soon need defences, and walls made of wood would be too susceptible to fire attacks, so they created a bench where they could chisel stone blocks into bricks, which they would need to build a defensive wall. Although the commander is also looking forward to sharing a room with Brom, he implores her to take some time away from building the new residences to finally construct the solar panel, along with a couple of batteries so that they can keep the power on at night. Before the end of the third day on the planet, Terciel had wooed Kelsier by boasting about how charming he was. Everyone is into different things, I guess. A few short days into their time on the doomed planet, and the only one still single, Tavi began to wonder if there was something special in the air of this place. He elected to keep a careful watch on the skies, just in case this planet planned on sending the love of his life crashing onto his head. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a native arrived with a look of curiosity and some items to trade. Tavi made sure to check his breath didn't smell bad, just in case. With the newly coupled Terciel and Kelsier, the group had a spare room in the residences with no occupant. They would find a use for it eventually, but for now they focused on outfitting each of the bedrooms with some creature comforts. With the beds removed from the shared shelter, it was finally time to set up the commander's research bench, so he could get started on understanding the techniques needed to operate deep drills to allow them to extract precious materials from below the surface. With some of the crew beginning to feel the effects of malnutrition, and the rice harvest still a ways off being ready, Tavi thought he might be able to solve two problems at once. He had seen a menacing looking warg near the shelter and was worried that hunger would soon drive it to attack one of the crew. So he elected to hunt it before it could, allowing him to treat everyone to a dinner of warg meat in the process. After piercing it with a few arrows, he left it to bleed out. It was an unfortunate end for the beast, but it was safer than him risking provoking it further by continuing to fire upon it. Little did Tavi know it was not the warg they needed to worry about, but instead the fearsome local guinea pigs. Driven mad by Scaria, one approached from the north, eager to feast on human flesh. Thankfully, Brom had been alert and was able to lead the rodent away from Terciel, who was busy mining out more components. In the process of luring and defeating the guinea pig, Brom also spotted a chunk of a crashed ship nearby, and elected to deconstruct it, knowing she would be more than capable of liberating some useful components from it. With the new stack of components, the crew were able to finish off the commander's workbench, allowing him to start his research, and also had enough left over to create an electric stove, and a cooling unit that would be required to make the freezer an actual freezer. Kelsier was familiar with sickness, however had no intention of letting it spread to the colony, so she insisted that the kitchen must be separated from the communal area to help keep it clean. She also suggested an airlock system of access to the freezer to ensure that it could maintain its temperature. The commander was happy to see the crew taking ownership of their new responsibilities, and agreed to rearrange the shared space to make room for a dedicated kitchen. With the cooling unit finally fitted in the freezer, the commander suggested adding another solar panel, just to ensure they didn't face any issues with the power draw of the unit. Knowing that they would require a ridiculous amount of materials in order to build a spaceship from scratch, Terciel suggested that they start stockpiling what they could from the surrounding landscape, starting with mining out the steel deposit that formed one wall of the shelter's shared area. Through his research, the commander felt confident that he knew what would be required to construct a deep drill, so he began putting together a prototype. It wouldn't be much use until they got a scanner to allow them to pinpoint nodes of valuable materials, but it would speed along his understanding of the topic. While he did this, things were progressing in other corners of the shelter. Brom was connecting power to their residences, and Tavi was laying out stones in the shape of a defensive perimeter to show Brom where would be best to start constructing it. Things seemed to be going well, so it came as no surprise to anyone that this was the moment a hostile member of a local faction approached. The raider was a poorly equipped child, but he was clearly skilled, and the crew decided that they might try and convince the raider to join them. If he could be subdued without death, that is. The commander was generally quite welcoming, but he knew he had to be careful about the balance of things. Gaining additional members to the crew from the surrounding factions would mean that they could progress with researching and building the ship faster, making their survival more likely. However, the more people they had, the larger the eventual ship would need to be to ensure that it could provide for all of them until they could reach a new planet. For now, however, one more addition wouldn't hurt. Tavi was happy with his position as chief security officer for the shelter, and ventured out to engage the raider before he could get close to the rest of the crew. He landed a good shot to the raider's left leg, which seemingly left him quite confused as he attempted to move away from Tavi. Tavi elected not to engage further, allowing blood loss to take care of the raider without risking immediate death in the form of an arrow through the head. The commander had said he'd prefer to take him alive. Once the raider eventually fell to the ground, Tavi returned to capture him, keeping him captive in the extra room at their residences. The raider, Jay, had a different set of beliefs from the crew, however they didn't have time to waste to try and convert him to their way of thinking. Instead, they opted to focus on convincing him to join them. It turned out to be quite an easy task once they explained to him that the world was going to explode with him on it unless he helped them escape. After mining out a fair chunk of the steel, Tercel turned his attention to cutting bricks, quickly accumulating a large stack, plenty enough to allow Brom to finish the northern section of the defensive wall. With this section complete, Tavi began to lay out the foundations for the south and west sides of the perimeter. Just outside the base, there were the ruins of some giant old mechanoid, but most concerning was a flashing red light emanating from it. The commander was perturbed by the light, so sent Tercel and Tavi to ensure that the thing was destroyed. The last thing he needed was a seemingly dead mechanoid resurrecting and attacking them. Finishing up his research into deep drills, the commander immediately moved on to researching ground-penetrating scanners. On the assumption that Jay would eventually decide to join them, Kelsier suggested that they plant some psychoid leaves. She recognised that Jay was a waster and as such would have a genetic dependency on psychoid. The commander agreed that they should plant some, and he agreed to work with Kelsier to understand how they could brew the psychoid into a tea that would be an effective way to stave off Jay's dependency. The old mechanoid eventually went up in a ball of flames, which Tercel and Tavi managed to narrowly avoid. It left behind a transponder, which the commander decided to investigate when he got a chance. Following a few days of mundanity, with everyone simply getting on with their jobs, Brom and the commander decided to spice things up, and ended up getting Brom pregnant in the process. It wasn't exactly the extra pair of hands they'd been hoping for, but they were taking things as they come. Clearly hearing of the crew's peaceable nature from their previous visitor, a trader toting numerous pieces of combat equipment arrived at the shelter looking to do business. The commander perused his wares, but there was nothing that would be of use to them, unfortunately. Knowing now that traders may stop by occasionally, Kelsier suggested planting some smoke leaf. They could turn it into joints that would be sold for a nice profit, a tactic used widely by the rebellion to accrue funds. They may need things from traders in the future, so it would be sensible to stockpile a little silver. As the commander finally got around to decrypting the transponder they pulled off the old mech, a ship crashed nearby, ejecting the body of a dead mechanator, and his trusty mechanoid, which seemed to have gone docile in his absence. Brom immediately set to work dismantling the ship, being sure not to let anything go to waste. The commander had never been a fan of mechanators due to the pollution their kind caused. However, given that this planet was going to be obliterated soon, and that a mechanoid could help them out, he elected to implant the mechanator's mech link in himself. As he did so, a small hauler mechanoid dropped from orbit to answer to its new master. Anticipating that their research speed may prove to be something of a bottleneck in their attempts to leave the planet, the commander suggested setting up a second research bench. It would cost them a lot of their materials and put extra strain on the power grid, but it would be worth it to allow another member of the crew to help him out with their research. Noticing that Brom was spending some of her time waiting around for more bricks to be cut so that she could finish the perimeter wall, Kelsier suggested that she spend the extra time on fishing on the nearby beach. Their freezer wasn't exactly overflowing, so every little would help. Anticipating the completion of the south and west wall sections soon, Tavi began to map out the east section. His plan was to have a single entrance to the base that raiders would attempt to use, which he could then litter with traps to slow them in their approach, minimising their risk to the crew. Unfortunately, before he could get close to finishing the perimeter wall, a raid from Jay's people arrived. There were 4 of them, armed with guns, which was quite the cause for concern given the crew's current equipment consisted only of shortbows. Tavi suggested heading out to meet them in the field. The raiders had arrived in 2 groups of 2, so he had hoped he could engage half of the raiders at a time and take advantage of the cover provided by some nearby ruins. Although they only had bows, Kelsier tagged the first raider to approach, and Tavi finished them with a clean shot to the head. They decided to stack up near the exit to the ruins and rush the second raider, hoping to overwhelm him with numbers. It was successful, but not without cost, as Tavi took a number of hits from the raider's gun. The other 2 raiders had ignored the crew and made for the shelter, intent on destroying it. As the crew returned to face them, Tavi was unfortunately subject to another barrage of bullets, and he hit the ground, bleeding out but still alive. The crew tried rushing the attacker once more, this time with Kelsier engaging him in hand-to-hand combat to prevent him from using his gun, while the others fired a volley of arrows at him. Tercio took a hit in the charge, but it was minor. To avoid further injury to Tercio or Tavi, the crew suggested that Tercio stay back and tend to Tavi's wounds whilst they engaged the final attacker. The crew opted for the same strategy again, this time using the hauler mechanoid to engage the raider in close combat while they flanked with the arrow volley. Unfortunately, the mechanoid did not appear to be a key target for the raider, and she set her sights on Kelsier instead, landing a number of shots on her before finally going down. With the threat over, the commander tended to Kelsier and the mechanoid. This had been a dangerous raid, however with the defeat of the raiders, the crew now had access to some rudimentary guns, which would help them deal with the next attack more effectively. The pain from his multitude of wounds was too much for Tavi, and he broke down in a daze, wandering aimlessly across the peninsula. The crew let him take the time he needed. He had done well by them since they landed, and had been repaid in pain. They understood his anguish. Finishing up his research into ground-penetrating scanners, the commander began researching fabrication. This would allow them to create their own components from steel, and would be a vital stepping stone on their way to understanding the complexities of starship components. Following the damage dealt by the recent attack, Brom had redoubled her efforts to complete the perimeter wall and was making good progress. With the completion of the perimeter wall, Tavi started planning out where to place reusable steel traps. However, the commander wouldn't allow him to create many as he was concerned about using up too much steel, so Tavi had to settle for just 2 traps and instead rethink his defensive strategy. Soon after this, the commander finally convinced Jay to join them in their endeavours. Through his discussions with Jay whilst he was a prisoner, he had come to have a good understanding of him. Jay was only 13 and had grown up as a child prodigy. Unfortunately, in his faction, intelligence was secondary to violence, and as such he'd been sent to attack the crew to prove his worth. And we all saw how that went for him. The commander, however, values his intelligence and is keen to have Jay work on research alongside him to progress their understanding more quickly. With the joining of Jay, the completion of the perimeter wall, and the presence of some meals in their freezer, the crew was doing a good job of surviving their new environment. However, their new environment would only survive for roughly another 100 days, so it was vital that they continued to research and stockpile valuable materials as quickly as possible. This would need to be their focus in the coming weeks. Not wanting Jay to have a bad first impression, and forgetting that their first impression was puncturing him with multiple arrows, Brom did a quick sweep of the shelter to clean the place up and make it look a bit more presentable. Jay was already busy working away at the research bench, however. Although he had a few skills that would lend themselves to the colony, the commander was still worried about their research speed bottlenecking them, and besides, Jay's peg leg meant that he was more efficient sitting in front of the bench than he was running around the base trying to build or mine. Speaking of bad first impressions, Jay almost ended up spending his first night as a member of the crew sleeping in the fields outside. It was a few minutes into his nap before the commander realised that he had forgotten to reschedule the prison cell that Jay had been staying in as a bedroom. Terciel did question the impact it would have on Jay to force him to stay in the room where he had been kept captive, but Brom had had a long day and Terciel didn't want to push the concept of making her build a whole new bedroom. As Brom put the finishing touch on the south section of the defensive wall, her builder's instincts kicked in and, seeing an area entirely enclosed by walls, she began to add a roof to it. Thankfully, the commander noticed quickly and briefly explained to Brom why covering the solar panels with a roof might not be the smartest idea, so she quickly dismantled the little section she had put up. On the 8th of August of their first year on the planet, Kelsier and Brom worked together to bring in the first harvest of herbal medicine. Given how their time on the planet had been so far, it was just as well. They would likely need quite a lot of the stuff before too long. Hearing their excitement at being able to stockpile some medicine, the universe immediately decided to give them the middle finger and struck down both Jay and Tavi with the flu. They knew that escaping the planet would be an arduous task, but it was beginning to feel like the universe had a personal issue with the crew. Conscious that he really didn't want to risk losing one of the crew to something like the simple flu, the commander alleviated his restrictions on bed rest. When they had landed, he had asked them all to simply work through any injuries they obtained in order to keep progress moving. However, under Kelsier's recommendations, he allowed Jay and Tavi to stay in bed until they were better. This was Kelsier's area of expertise, and the commander listens to his experts. When it became clear that Jay was handling his infection well, he was asked to return to work. Tavi was still struggling a bit, however, which was putting the crew in a bit of a predicament as they really needed him out there hunting. Their freezer was empty. As he lay in bed recovering, Tavi began explaining the design he wanted for the defences. Eager to give him something to celebrate, Tarsiel began laying out the first trench and Brom began digging them. The presence of a table in Jay's room had led some of the crew to eating and relaxing there instead of in the shared room of the shelter. This had been fine for a while, but as was always the case, someone has to ruin a good thing for everyone. In this case, that someone was Tarsiel, who decided to hang out at the table while Jay was trying to sleep in the corner. It was his room after all. Following this, the commander demanded that the table be relocated to the shared area. He also recommended removing the chessboard and chair too, to avoid any of the crew becoming envious of Jay's extra furnishings. Sorry Jay, but you can blame Tarsiel for this one. The first harvest of the cotton field was soon ready. The primary reason for ensuring they planted some cotton early on was to ensure that they had it available to build spacesuits from. However, they were still a long way away from understanding how to tailor a spacesuit, so they elected to stockpile it for the time being. Tavi was still feeling the effects of the flu, but was feeling well enough to be out hunting and continuing to plan the defences. He began by setting out a row of wooden cavalry spikes in the entrance to the base. The idea was that any attackers who wanted to approach the crew or the base would need to clamber over these spikes, likely causing minor injuries and slowing their progress, giving the crew more time to riddle them with bullets as they climbed over. The commander had researched the ground penetrating scanner early, so that they could quickly set one up to get it to scanning. However, he had encountered an issue, as his research showed that constructing a scanner would require an advanced component. The arrival of the previous travellers had given him hope that more would arrive with whom he could trade and hopefully get a component, but none were forthcoming and time was slowly ticking down. As such, the commander decided the most reasonable next move would be to form a small caravan and head to the nearest local settlement, which the residents had named after their favourite hobby, study butt. It wasn't a long journey, setting off on foot from their base on the Arctis Peninsula, which they had named after the commander's ship. It was roughly a half-day walk each way. Deciding that Kelsier and Tarsiel had the least consistent work to be getting on with, he sent them to trade. Himself and Jay were far too busy with researching, and he didn't wish to send Tavi as he wanted to keep him around to protect the base. He claimed that he didn't want to send Brom as he had construction work that needed doing, but given how little there was to do around the base, it seems like there may have been other factors that influenced his decision to keep Brom nearby. Whatever his reasons, Tarsiel and Kelsier set off shortly after. It wasn't long before the commander realised his mistake. He had sent away the base's chef. With no one there to cook for them, they were staring down the prospect of a dinner of raw meat and berries. Given that Brom did in fact have less to do than the commander had suggested, and was in fact out fishing on the beach, he requested that she take over Kelsier's duties for the time being. After a night in the wilds, Kelsier and Tarsiel arrived at Study Butt early the next day. Given that the base's primary source of food thus far had been hunting, they had accumulated quite the supply of furs, which had been light enough for the two of them to carry with them, giving them something to offer in trade. To the duo's relief, the people of Study Butt had 4 advanced components that they were happy to trade. However, the combined value of their furs only allowed them to purchase 2 components on this trip, along with a little surplus silver to offer up in future trades. With their new components in tow, the two of them headed back towards the Arctis Peninsula. Following the fun night that they had just shared, the commander and Brom agreed to get married. It had been a bit of a whirlwind relationship, but hell, when you're staring down impending death, why wait? Kelsier and Brom approached Tavi and suggested an additional element to the defences, doors leading to each line of the trenches. Brom suggested that this would make it easier for her to access and repair the defences following an attack, without having to clamber over all of the spikes herself. Kelsier interjected that it would make it a lot easier to clear out the corpses of any attackers who fell in the trenches, ensuring that they could keep the base free from disease. Tavi agreed that this was a good addition, so gave the go-ahead for Brom to add some doors. In typical fashion, the moment Kelsier and Tarsiel returned to the base from their trading adventure, a bulk goods trader from the Purple Crag settlement arrived at the base, looking to do business. The traders didn't have anything in particular that the commander thought would be useful, however he took the opportunity to sell off their old beds. They would have been much too heavy for the crew to carry all the way to study, but the silver they would fetch would allow them to purchase more advanced components at a later time. With the advanced components finally sourced, the commander planned out the location of the ground penetrating scanner, in the protection of the courtyard at the rear of the shelter near the solar panels. The next day, Brom rushed to complete the scanner. Now that it was finished, it would automatically begin scanning the surrounding area for deposits of metals. Once a metal deposit was located, they could simply install a deep drill and Terciel could get to work extracting the metals. Nearing the end of their current research project, the commander and Jay thought it was time to finally construct a small fabrication bench. Once operational, it would allow them to use a small amount of steel to create simple components of their own. The one catch was that building the fabrication bench would require 2 advanced components, and they only had 1 left following the construction of the scanner. With this in mind, the commander prepared to send another caravan to Studybot to hopefully pick up the last 2 advanced components they had. This time he sent Jay and Kelsier. The commander had come to trust Jay after working alongside him at the research benches, and was happy with the speed at which they were progressing, so felt as though it was a good chance for Jay to leave the dark interior of the shelter for a day or two. It might do him some good. That night, a few chunks of spacecraft crashed out of orbit in the vicinity of the base. The commander asked Brom to deconstruct them to provide the crew with a good supply of basic components. With the addition of the scanner to their grid, they were using more power than the 2 solar panels could provide, and the batteries were beginning to drain. More components would allow them to expand the power grid to accommodate this and any future changes to their power requirements. They started by planning out the construction of another solar panel. The scanner soon made its first find, not metal, but a pocket of deep chem, a volatile chemical which, once extracted, could be refined into chem fuel. The commander took note of the location for future reference. Jay and Kelsier arrive at Studybot and offload some more furs, but sadly do not obtain enough silver to purchase both of the remaining advanced components, and instead leave with just 1. Combined with the one they have remaining at the base, this would be enough to create the fabrication bench. During the night, a poor boom rat, driven mad by scaria infection, attacks the colony. Tavi is confident he can handle the issue. Boom rats explode upon death, so, not wanting the boom rat to die upon the wooden spikes and thus set them on fire, he proceeded to the outer line of defences to attack the boom rat. Sadly, Tavi's aim is a little off this night, and he's unable to put down the boom rat before it gets within striking range of him. Conscious that he doesn't want to kill the boom rat in close proximity to himself either, to avoid setting himself on fire, Tavi retreats before putting it down, careful to make sure he doesn't let the ensuing fire spread to the wooden walls of the residences. The following day, during a deluge of rain, Brom experiences a major issue with the wooden spikes she has built as part of the defences. After a few days, they just fall apart. Embarrassed by this development, she spends some time developing a better design for the spikes that won't simply fall apart over time, and replaces all of the previous spikes with the new design. On their return trip from Studybot, Kelsier and Jay encounter a couple of scaria-infected pugs. As the only one currently armed, Kelsier takes the forward position and makes swift work of the pugs before they continue on their way back to the Arctis Peninsula. With 2 of the crew still out in the wilds and Tavi laid up in bed following their boom rat attack, a couple of raiders from the Notembium Empire take their opportunity to attack the colony. The defences are still very much a work in progress, however Terciel and the injured Tavi leap into action to defend the base. Much to their advantage, the poor raiders have brought clubs and axes to a gunfight, and, even outnumbered, the crew make quick work of them. Tavi's confidence in dealing with the boom rat, however, has cost him dearly, as he's received an infection in both his left shoulder and his torso. Tercio tends to his wounds and recommends he stays in bed until the infections have passed, to give him the best chance of beating them. With their research into fabrication complete, Jay and the commander immediately move on to researching multi-analyzers to allow them to undertake more advanced research projects. The commander had hoped that by completing their research into fabrication prior to building the fabrication bench, that it would make the construction easier. However, much to his dismay, Brom unfortunately botched the initial construction, wasting one of the extremely precious advanced components in the process. Wanting to try and make a positive out of a bad situation, Brom promptly took the remains of their failed fabrication bench and fashioned them into another battery. With the third solar panel, they were now producing more than they needed, so they could store some more. The next day saw the harvest of both the smoke leaf and the cornfield. Corn is a wonderfully high yield crop, so Kelsier had hopes that this harvest would see them through the winter months, when it would likely become too cold for them to grow anything more. The commander was becoming frustrated with the lack of progress towards their goals, and so decided to tick at least one thing off the list for the eventual starship: fuel. He laid out plans to build a deep chem pump to extract the deep chem from the pocket that the scanner had found and route it through some pipes to a refinery just inside the walls of the base, where it could be turned into chem fuel. From here, they could store it in tankers, ready to power the ship once it was complete. Maybe this starship wouldn't be powered by fecal sludge after all. The commander was also careful to ensure his plans included some walls to protect the refinery and the chem fuel storage tank, as they were near the entrance of the base, and it would be far too easy for a stray bullet from a raider to set them alight. Following a slaughter of the poor llamas which had wandered onto the peninsula, the commander decided that they might have enough furs to sell to purchase the last advanced component in study butt, allowing them to finally build the fabrication bench, assuming no one botched the construction again. This time, Tercio was sent on his own to trade with study butt to reduce the downtime in the crew's forward momentum. Shortly after overcoming his infections and injuries, Tavi was struck down with malaria, as was Brom. This planet really seemed to have it out for poor Tavi. No wonder he was the sole crew member experiencing a lot of mental breaks. It's hard to keep positive when a whole planetary body is out to get you. The horrible news was only slightly lightened by the harvesting of the first batch of psychoid leaves. They couldn't yet process them to allow Jay to satiate his dependency, but they would work on that soon. Naturally, the first time the commander elects to send a single colonist on a trade mission, they get ambushed by a raider along the way. The raider demands Tercio's furs and silver, but he's in no mood for a shakedown and has plenty of experience dealing with these types back on the hub world. The raider is equipped with a gun, whereas Tercio still only has a bow. Instead of engaging at a distance, he makes his location clear to the raider and then hides in cover, waiting for them to approach. Once the raider is close, Tercio charges him, getting close enough that the raider can no longer use their gun effectively. In a fistfight, Tercio's mass and toughness make it an easy contest, and he makes light work of the raider. Equipping himself with the gun that the raider so kindly donated, he packs up his things and continues on to Study Butt. Arriving at Study Butt, he manages to sell the furs for enough to purchase the last component, and also treats himself to some chocolate, a well-deserved treat for the dangers he had to face along the way. While the commander was focused on other things, Brom completed construction of the small fabrication bench. It was a nice surprise for the commander, as watching her build it would have induced a lot of anxiety in the commander. The research team were progressing well with their research into the multi-analyzer, so they mapped out a location to build a prototype in range of both of their benches. A group of mildly angry seals attacked the base at the direction of another faction. Thankfully, it seems as though seals are no better at getting through the crew's defences than an axe-wielding human is, so they made for some fine target practice. The best thing about the seal attack, however, is that it was the result of a request from a friendly faction. The crew's payment for dispatching the dastardly seals? 2 whole advanced components, a ridiculously helpful reward for such a simple task. The temperatures had dropped suddenly, hitting -20 degrees. The sudden freeze, combined with his dependency for Psychoid going unfulfilled, caused Jay to throw a tantrum and start destroying one of the research benches. The commander would have tried to stop him, however at that exact moment Brom went into labour. Brom was already suffering from malaria and the room was too cold for Tercio to tend to Brom effectively. Despite a rush to build a large fire in the room and provide heat, it was not enough and the baby sadly didn't survive. They buried the poor soul in a grave inside the protection of the perimeter wall. Although the destruction of one of their precious research benches by Jay caused the commander great anger, he realised it was a result of his failure not to look after his crew. He immediately put a pause to the multi-analyzer research and began researching how to refine the psychoid that they had harvested into a form of tea so that they could use it to treat Jay's dependency. With neither the components nor the steel necessary to replace the research bench at the moment, Jay was relegated to researching out in the field. The scanner had been running all this time and had found a few deposits, including some steel, some plasteel, and some gold. They would need all of these in abundance in order to build the ship eventually, so Tercio installed a deep drill over the gold deposit and began extracting it. Finally brewing some psychoid tea, Kelsier suggested that Jay drink one every 2 days. This would ensure that their supplies lasted through the winter, during which they couldn't grow any more, while also ensuring that he didn't feel any negative impacts from his dependency. Having lacked the components to make the pump and the refinery for the deep chem, the commander had cancelled their construction and instead suggested creating a refinery that would allow them to use their waste to create chem fuel. Maybe this ship would be powered with fecal sludge after all. He made sure it was located outside though, for the sake of everyone's sense of smell. Anticipating the need to have a safe space to store the flammable chem fuel, the commander decided to build a new room onto the shelter, specifically to store it away from any other flammable substances. In their free time, Brom and the commander had begun to develop a rough plan for the ship, and Brom realised it would likely require a large area to be constructed, ideally inside the defences, so as to avoid being damaged by raiders before they could launch it. In anticipation of the construction, they elected to remove some more of the ruins that were in the base. They were definitely getting ahead of themselves, but pretending they were close to building the ship was good for morale. As Tercia was using some of their steel to make components, a group of angry insectoids appeared on the peninsula. Even nature itself was turning against them, as if the roving bands of murderers and impending planetary destruction wasn't enough to contend with. Thankfully, their guns allowed them to maintain a safe distance whilst peppering the insects with lead. The insects also revealed a minor security flaw which Tavi had failed to notice. The ruins they had incorporated into the walls of the base had some doors hidden in them that Tavi had failed to secure. Using these doors allowed one of the insects to circumvent the defences. Following the attack, the crew made sure to ridicule Tavi endlessly for overlooking an unlocked door during his extensive planning of the base's defences. With the whole planet out to get them, and the days until the planet-killing weapon hits them continuing to count down, the situation was beginning to feel more desperate by the day. But this was a crew of rebels who had defied an empire. They thrived in desperate situations, and were determined that this one would be no different.
Meh, 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 meh. Meow.
We returned to the crew following a night of somewhat disturbed sleep. With the addition of the fabrication bench, the poop processor, the new heater in the shared room, and soon to be the multi-analyzer, the crew's power supply was struggling to keep the lights on during the night. As the issue seemed to be keeping the batteries fully charged, as opposed to having enough batteries, they utilised some of the new components which Tercio had crafted to add an additional solar panel into the mix. With the ability to turn steel into components and, feeling as though they had plenty of steel, the crew were finally free to add additional tech to their setup. They started by finishing the multi-analyzer, and then they rebuilt the research bench, which Jay had destroyed in his anger. With these upgrades, their research speed would hit new highs, bringing them ever closer to understanding space travel. The crew were making good progress, however morale was still up and down. In an effort to improve this, Brom suggested that she spend some time furnishing the rooms of the residents with tiled floors. They'd not yet had time to beautify the rooms, so they still had floors of dirt and grass, and the tiling would be a significant improvement. Just as things seemed to be calming down for a little bit, the crew were treated to some good news. Kelsier was pregnant. With the addition of the new drill and the research bench, the power grid was becoming a little strained again, so a fifth solar panel was added, this time out the front of the shelter. Given that the temperatures outside were still freezing, and, conscious to avoid Kelsier befalling the same fate that Brom had, the commander instructed Brom to install 2 heaters in their residences, with vents between the rooms to allow for the transfer of heat. The rooms were small enough that this should be more than enough to keep them warm. Following long weeks at their desks, Jane the commander finally felt confident that they understood how to properly utilise the multi-analyzer, and began researching how they could produce advanced components for themselves. Given how much trouble they'd gone to obtain the few they'd already used, being able to craft them themselves would be a massive boon, especially given their assumption that the construction of a spacecraft would require a large number of them. Although time was pressing, the whole crew took this moment of success to put down their tools and celebrate the long-awaited wedding of Commander Gardner and Brom. With little to their name, it was a small ceremony, followed by an intimate party with the crew all just enjoying each other's company. Despite their situation, it was important that they continued to celebrate the successes and joys that life had to offer them. The next day, Kelsier and Tersail decided that it was their turn and invited the whole crew to join them in celebrating their marriage. Within seconds of it starting, the commander and Tavi broke into a fistfight. Usually blood and pain would put a bit of a dampener in proceedings, but Tersail and Kelsier pressed on with their specialty. Following a few days of calm, during which everyone was simply getting on with their jobs, researching, mining, cooking, fishing, the crew was just about ready to turn in for the night when they heard the telltale screech of subsonic shock trooper drop pods. It seems this planet hadn't figured out space travel, but had managed to figure out the trick to sending people hurtling through the skies at high speed in order to take enemies by surprise. Moments later, 5 furred attackers crashed into Kelsier and Tersail's room and immediately began smashing it up and setting it alight. As Brom was unarmed at the time, the commander sent her in first to wedge the door open, after which she could make a speedy retreat while the rest of the crew fired through the door indiscriminately from their position of advantage. The attackers charged them, but the crew began a tactical retreat, peppering the attackers with bullets as they ran. The crew would eventually manage to knock down a number of the attackers, causing those remaining to panic and attempt to flee, but the crew made quick work of them. Although Kelsier and Tersail's room looked a little worse for wear, there was no lasting damage, aside from the destruction of the door, which could be easily replaced. The quick and clean outcome in favour of the crew was a testament to their teamwork and survival prowess. Having turned off the poop processor to conserve energy meant that the research benches had been fully operational for days, allowing the commander and Jay to make quick work of learning to understand the construction of advanced components. With that understanding under their belts, they finally felt ready to begin the research into how to apply those advanced components to create a starship. Building the ship would require many separate research projects, however, they started with trying to understand how to create an airtight hull which could survive the vacuum of space. With their understanding advancing so quickly and so much time left until the planet killer weapon tore the ground asunder, the commander was beginning to feel hopeful. Brom however chided him for this, reminding him that understanding the requirements was only a small part of the battle. Actually finding the resources to construct the ship and keeping it safe until it was ready to launch was a different matter entirely. With this in mind, the commander suggested constructing a communications console and some trade beacons. It was a risky course of action. They couldn't risk hailing anyone openly as there were likely to be Imperial ships in orbit, waiting to observe the results of the planet killer's test fire. But the commander's Pathfinder past meant he felt confident that he knew of ways in which to identify passing ships that might be friendly to their plight. They couldn't risk asking a ship to pick them up, as any ship attempting to land on the planet would likely be flagged by the Empire and destroyed, but they may be able to exchange goods with them from a distance, allowing them to source some additional materials for their build. As they continued their research, they felt confident enough in their understanding of spaceship hull composition to start laying out the rough outline of a first room of the ship. Even just a small first room would require a significant volume of steel, plasteel and components to put together. Although Tersail had spent weeks mining plasteel and steel and crafting components just for this occasion, these stockpiles were quickly exhausted with minimal progress on the first room of the ship. Worse still, with their understanding of ship hulls not quite complete and the freezing temperatures outside, Brom was struggling to build the hull, botching multiple sections of it and wasting more of their already limited resources. The frustration of feeling so close but so far from their goal was getting to the crew, but the commander consoled them with the fact that they were so far ahead of where they had initially anticipated that they were still in a good position to get off this rock. As if hearing the commander trying to keep morale up, a group of raiders picked that very moment to raid the base. These raiders were well equipped, toting guns instead of the crude melee weapons of their predecessors. They seemed to be taking some time to size up their options and determine the best way to attack the base, and Brom took full advantage of this, using the time to erect a wall of sandbags at the end of the entrance to the base. The sandbags would provide additional cover for the crew, reducing the chances of them being gunned down while allowing them to return fire to the exposed raiders as they clambered through the defensive system. Unfortunately for the crew, the raiders' weapons had a similar effective range to theirs, so the raiders didn't need to clamber over the defences and instead kept their distance. The two groups traded fire for a while, leading to a bloody and drawn-out affair. Eager to draw the attackers through the defences to inflict extra damage on them and give themselves time to tend to their wounded, the crew beat a risky retreat, breaking from the safety of their cover to escape around the wall of the entrance. None of them had escaped the first encounter unscathed. The commander and Tavi were the worst off, so Kelsier and Tercio prioritised treating their wounds. The longer they stayed standing, the longer they could fight. As they tended to their wounded, a number of the attackers succumbed to blood loss following the initial firefight. With only a couple left standing and the worst of their wounds treated, the crew rushed the attackers and felled them quickly. The final attacker had gone around the south of the base, presumably to attack the crew's exposed mining equipment. However, the crew had no intention of letting him. Angry from the damage that had been inflicted by his comrades, they surged out of the gates at the rear of the base and made quick work of the final attacker. They shot him dead while he was knee-deep in the corpses of their dumping ground. That would save them a trip later. The crew treated their wounds and returned to bed for a short nap before starting the day. There was no time to spare for letting their wounds heal fully, they had work to get on with. As Brom continued working on the hull of the ship, the commander and Jay felt as though they finally had a good understanding of the construction of ship hulls, and began to choose which aspect of the ship would form the basis of their next project. After a brief discussion, they decided that life support systems would be up next. They would need oxygen and water if they had any hope of surviving in the ship. With the ship finally becoming a tangible object, if not a very sturdy or fit-for-purpose object, the commander decided it was time to actually start extracting the deep chem from the nearby deposit. The lack of components that had stopped them initially wouldn't be an issue anymore now that they could craft some themselves. Or so he thought. The commander and Jay had made incredibly light work of their research into life support systems and, with the deep chem pump now available, moved straight onto researching rocket propulsion. Once they had the chem fuel, they would need the engines to feed it into. The commander's suggestion that they could now create their chem fuel network as components wouldn't be scarce was only partially correct. What he'd unfortunately failed to account for was the fact that both the network and the components required steel, which they were suddenly sorely lacking in. Tercio had been mining away consistently at the steel deposit underneath the solar panels, but despite his skill, mining with a deep drill was just an inherently slow task, and he wasn't able to keep up with the demands of both the starship and the chem fuel network. Having discussed the build of the ship with the commander at length over their time on the planet, Brom knew that the commander had been anticipating building a nuclear reactor on board the ship to provide power for the life support systems and all other auxiliary systems they would need. However, as Brom was outside working on a section of the hull near the solar panel, she had an idea. What if they used solar power for the ship? She ran inside to speak to the commander about this, and after a brief discussion with Jay, they both agreed it was a good idea. They already knew how to build solar panels, so no new research would be needed, which would help them speed up the building process. And, as the hull wasn't finished yet, they wouldn't need to tear down many completed parts of the ship to include the solar panels. The commander and Brom began planning out where on the ship these would go, and Jay interjected that, while the ship was still on the ground, they could use the solar panels they attached to it to feed into the shelter's power grid, making the most of the materials they would be using. This would involve extending the perimeter wall to allow the solar panels to unfurl completely, but that was a small ask in the grand scheme of things. The days were progressing slowly. Terrasail finished clearing off all of the surface steel from the peninsula. It was faster to extract than mining from below the surface, however, it was soon gone and only the subsurface steel remained. What little he had gathered from above ground had allowed him to finish the chem fuel network, however, the ship hull was still in a state of chaos. Relieved to finally be able to celebrate a small win, Brom turned on the deep chem pump and started pumping deep chem straight out into the environment. It seems as though she'd messed up a connecting pipe somewhere. She quickly shut it off to minimise the environmental impact, of course. On the planet that was going to be blown to pieces in 6 to 8 days. At least she has a code and she lives by it. Although the plan to add the ship's solar panels to the shelter's power grid had been a solid one, they currently did not have the materials required to build the ship's solar panels, and, with power grid struggling once more, they had to build a sixth, static solar panel. Conscious that they had accumulated a sizable number of animal pelts over the last few weeks, and would soon need an abundance of advanced components for the ship, the commander sent Kelsier on a little trip to Studybot to trade. Why he sent the only member of the crew who was heavily pregnant off on a trek into the wilds, who can really say? With the leak in the system fixed, the refinery finally saw action and chem fuel began to be produced. Brom had made a storage tank for it inside the ship, so as to provide a repository that could be used to automatically refuel the engines once they were in space. The researchers were speeding through the ship-based research projects at a rate of knots. I guess working on a number of projects all around the same general area of understanding was helping them understand the new topics quickly. They moved on to navigation next. The ship wouldn't get anywhere without a pilot and a control console. There was plenty of construction work to be done, specifically on the starship. However, without the required materials, no progress could be made. Given the ridiculous amount of materials they would need, and the ridiculous lack of time they had to get them, Tercio requested that Brom hop onto the second deep drill to help him extract some metal. Kelsier arrived at Studybot and purchased all three of their advanced components, along with some fancy meals for herself with the excess silver. Given she was heavily pregnant and had been sent on a trek across the landscape, she didn't think the commander could argue with her treating herself. As night fell on the 1st of April May, a clutch of angry beavers threw themselves at the crew. Thankfully the crew were able to deftly handle the beavers and absolutely smash them. As it was April May, and thus spring once again, it was growing season. Tercio asked Brom to help him sow the fields while Kelsier was still away. He thought it would be a nice treat for her to return to see the fields already planted, especially given the late stage of her pregnancy. Working the fields would have been a slow and tedious task for her. As it turns out, Tercio definitely had the right idea, as immediately upon her return the next morning, Kelsier went into labour. Not sure whether he should attend the birth in the role of father-to-be or in the role of the doctor, Tercio instead did neither and left the base to go and plant some rice while his baby was born back home. Thankfully, despite Tercio's best attempts at extreme negligence, Kelsier gave birth to a happy, healthy baby, the first new rebel of the next generation. With Kelsier out travelling and then immediately bedbound following the birth, Brom had been left to do the cooking, which led to some very foreseeable outcomes. Determined to reduce the blackouts that the crew had experienced during the night time as a result of their solar-based power grid, Brom suggested incorporating a small chem fuel powered generator into their grid. They were already producing a lot of chem fuel, most of which was going to storage, so it made sense to use some of it to power a small 24/7 power source. Progress was feeling increasingly slow, and the crew ended the day with very little to show for their efforts. The ship was no closer to being built, and most of the time had been spent trying to mine materials to continue the build. Thankfully, Jay and the commander were able to keep morale up by finishing another research project. With the ability to create a navigation console, they moved on to understanding how to build heat sinks. The ship would need heaters in order to keep it at a livable temperature. However, given that the hull would need to insulate them from the freezing temperatures of the vacuum of space, it would also keep all the heat in. If they didn't control this heat properly, it could lead to them cooking alive inside the ship. A heatsink would be vital to allow them to vent the excess heat into the vacuum in order to avoid this. Just as the crew were waking up, a rain of fire and debris began crashing down upon the peninsula. It appeared as though two ships had engaged in some sort of combat just above the planet's atmosphere, and pieces of the damaged ships were falling out of orbit and raining down upon the planet. This was extremely dangerous. There was no telling where the next piece of debris would land, and if it hit one of the crew, there wasn't much they could do about it. If they all survived, however, it could prove to be a useful boon, as many of the ship chunks that would crash down could be dismantled for parts to help them build their own ship. Some poor unfortunate souls survived their fall from the ship battle into the planet, with injuries that could theoretically be remedied. However, the commander was too conscious of the danger involved in approaching them to allow the crew to rescue anyone. He couldn't risk somebody being hit by falling debris. With some of the materials from the fallen ship chunks at their disposal, Brom was finally able to continue work on their own ship, finishing more of the wall sections and even filling out some of the floor of the hull. She had also managed to build the first solar panel on the ship. It was only a small thing, but it felt like a great success to all of the crew. The ship was now technically producing power. In fact, in order for the rest of the ship's proposed solar panels to fully extend, they would need to deconstruct one of the static solar panels. Contrary to what you might think, this felt like good news to the crew. They could replace the lost power from the static panel with the 2 new ones on the ship, and could even use some of the components from the static panel for this purpose. With the hull finally taking shape, the commander began to plan out the location of a few of the basics of the ship. The minimum number of advanced components required for just the life support system would be 12, a ridiculous amount compared to what they had managed to source so far. This is where the real difficulty would lie in their plans. Preparing plans for the life support and the pilot's console in the first room was part of the contingency the commander was planning. The ideal situation would see them in a ship large enough to sustain them for weeks, or perhaps indefinitely. There was no telling how long it may take them to find a safe location to land. However, in the worst case scenario, the commander would settle for a tiny ship, so long as it could get them off the planet before it was destroyed. If that had to be the case, then they would figure out how to survive in space once they got there. With that in mind, if this single small room could fit everything they would need to take flight, then that would be the worst case scenario prepared for. Finishing up their research into heat sinks, the research team moved on to researching capacitor arrays. Ships could require a lot of power, and as this one would be solar powered, it would be important to store power when they could. Capacitor arrays stored far more than batteries and were more efficient. They would need a few of these on the ship to help survive the trip. With still almost a year to go before the planet killer weapon reached them, Brom suggested that they would have plenty of time to build a larger hull for the ship, allowing for a more comfortable experience. The primary difficulty would be building the ship's systems, not the hull. The commander agreed and directed them to place down an extra room in the ship, although this first required extending the perimeter wall. In hindsight, they may have chosen a less than ideal location to start the building of the ship. With their research into capacitors complete, the research team moved on to trying to understand hydroponics. These would be vital if the crew were to reach their ideal situation, as it would allow them to produce food and other plant-based materials aboard the ship while they travelled. If they wanted to be able to survive for a long time up there, they would need hydroponics. With the ridiculous amount of advanced components it would take to create the life support system, and many other systems in the ship, the commander instructed Tercio to begin crafting their own advanced components, using gold, plasteel, and steel that they had mined from the surrounding area. Despite this command, Tercio wasn't showing any signs of making any progress in this task. The commander figured that maybe he needed a larger, more sophisticated fabrication bench in order to achieve his goal, so began clearing out additional space in the chem fuel storage area, in which to place down a larger bench. However, he soon realised that the real issue was far greater than that. Crafting advanced components requires a crafting skill of 12. Tercio just didn't have the skill required to make advanced components, and, despite his skill in crafting, he wasn't exactly passionate about it. The commander was devastated, but he knew how to handle this. Tercio was assigned to crafting rocks and to throwing rocks until he managed to acquire the finesse that would be required to make advanced components. It looks like it's time for a montage. While Tercio was busy having his montage moment, this left the crew with other problems. Tercio was the best miner in the group, but with him focused solely on crafting for the time being, they would be even more restricted on materials than before. The others would need to step in to pick up some of the slack, otherwise by the time Tercio was ready to craft the components, they wouldn't have any of the materials required for them. As they began to plan out the new room for the ship, the crew realised that they would require more space than initially thought, and planned to move the perimeter wall out even further. They were careful not to remove the old wall section until the new one was built, however. No one wanted a surprise group of raiders to just walk straight into the base. The initial idea behind the second room was that it would be a storage area. The first room alone didn't give them much space to actually store anything, and they were hoping to stockpile some meals on the ship before they left. With the commander helping pick up some of the slack on the mining side of things, Jay was left to handle the research on his own. They had completed plenty of their research projects though, so were no longer concerned about that holding them back. Jay began researching ship shields. Shields were vital for surviving ship-based combat. However, the commander was hoping they would be small enough to stay under the radar of any ships looking for trouble, so researching shields was mostly a just in case. 2 days into Tercio's montage, the commander decided it would benefit them to send a caravan to study Butt again. His primary hope was that they could pick up a skill trainer which would instantly give Tercio the boost he needed. But, failing that, perhaps they could pick up some more advanced components to let them continue with the ship construction while they waited for him to learn. As one of their better traders, the commander himself set out on this journey. In the commander's absence, Brom oversaw the further expansion of the perimeter wall to allow for the increasing size of the ship. As she did so, the wisdom of not demolishing the old wall until the new one was complete came to be shown. A large raid approached the base. The raiders were tribal and equipped with a few ranged weapons, but nothing that would likely compete with the crew's guns. The crew took up their defensive positions and laid down a barrage of bullets. Some of the raiders got a little close, but they never really stood a chance. With Tercio's montage well underway, the crew had an abundance of throwing rocks, which seemed to have no value to traders. As a result, they designated an area on the beach outside where they could leave the rocks to deteriorate. Arriving at Study Butt, the commander is saddened to find that they don't have the skill trainer he was hoping for, but he does manage to pick up 2 advanced components before heading home. Upon returning, the commander utilises the 2 advanced components he'd picked up to build the larger fabrication bench. Although this won't speed up their ability to create their own advanced components, it will allow them to build EVA suits. Sadly, EVA suits also require advanced components, leaving them out of reach for the time being. That day, a meteor of pure solid gold falls nearby. This meteor should provide enough gold that they no longer need to use the deep drill to extract some from beneath the ground. Following his earlier run-in with a bunch of rabid hares, Tavi had got an infection yet again. Either this man has a shockingly bad immune system, or he's just deathly allergic to small animals. Speaking of dangerous animals, as Brom was stuck inside the ship, filling out the hull of the second room, a lynx cornered her and moved in for the kill. This was a horribly dangerous situation. Brom had nowhere to run, and if she got knocked down, the lynx wouldn't be content to just leave her bleeding out. It wanted food, and it was going to make sure it got it. Despite his condition, Tavi ran from his room to the ship, desperate to save Brom. Before he could get there, Brom was knocked down, and the lynx began to feast. Thankfully, using his superior gun skills, Tavi was able to thread a few shots through the opening in the door and tag the lynx, causing it to shift its focus to him. Brom had taken a severe beating, but if they could get to her soon, she should survive. As Tavi lured the lynx away, Tercio immediately rushed in to help Brom. She would survive, although it was perhaps mostly due to her coagulator bionic. Without it, she may have bled out far before anyone could reach her. Although she would survive, it would take her some time to overcome the injuries. A group of sellswords arrived at the peninsula. They didn't have much to trade, but they were interested in the gold that the crew had accumulated from the meteor which had fallen to the peninsula. The crew were happy to part with some of it, in exchange for silver that they could use on future trading missions. Determined not to be the cause of any delays to their plans, Brom was soon back on her feet and finishing the hull in the second room of the ship. They had been unable to complete the hull in the first room as they couldn't build underneath the chemfuel tank, so they made plans to build a new tank in the second room, which they could then transfer the stored fuel into. This would allow them to dismantle the first tank and finally finish the floor of the hull in the first room. With the ship's fuel network planned, they could also begin to plan the ship's engines, starting with expanding the perimeter wall once more. With steel supplies becoming an ever-increasing issue, the crew saved up enough to create a smelter. This would allow them to generate usable steel from the chunks of steel slag littered around the peninsula, and they could do it at a far faster rate than digging up steel through the deep drills. They built some shelves in the second room, since it was supposed to be a storage room, and spent the last advanced component that they had to build the pilot's console. That was one more requirement ticked off the list, which was just the kind of win they needed, with the days ticking down. As Brom finally finished the floor of the hull in the main room, she began to plan out the engines. When they took off, the engines would cause an area of fire behind the ship, but given that they would never return to this planet again, as it was about to be blown up, it didn't matter very much whether the base burnt down after takeoff. In order to create the sensors that they would need to fly the ship, they first had to research long-range mineral scanners, so Jay set to work on that. Although they hoped to have space on the ship to grow food to sustain themselves, this would only likely be the outcome in the best case scenario. With that in mind, the commander directed Kelsier to begin creating packaged survival meals, which they could then stockpile on the ship. With Tercio still montaging away in the corner, the commander and Brom set off to Studybot once more, hoping for skill trainers or advanced components. Naturally, while the crew were down 2 people, is exactly when the raiders decided to strike. Arriving in drop pods, they oddly decided to land directly in Kelsier and Tarsiel's room once again. The raiders were well armed, but thankfully for the crew, they seemed much more interesting in trying to steal Kelsier and Terciel's baby than in fighting, allowing the crew to take them down quickly, saving both the baby and all of the furniture. Upon arriving at Studybot, the commander and Brom were dismayed to find that they have neither skill trainers nor advanced components for sale. Determined not to return empty-handed, they head off to the next nearest settlement that's willing to trade with them. It's a fair distance, but with mainly roads between them, it shouldn't take too long. Sadly, upon arriving at that settlement, named Larney Lake, there were still no skill trainers or advanced components. Heads low, they began to make their way back to the peninsula. Before the caravan could return, another raid arrived, this time comprised of Neanderthals. They had poor equipment, but were extremely hardy, so would require a fair bit of damage to put down. With Tavi feeling extremely unhappy, the others manned the defences, in the hopes that he wouldn't have to. But the raiders were taking a bit too long to put down, so Tavi joined them to try and speed up the process. With his help, they were soon able to put an end to the raid. Burning through what little hope they had left, the commander and Brom redirected their journey to visit Studybot once more on their way home. Maybe they might have some new stock to trade with. Sadly, this wasn't the case, and the caravan prepared to return home empty-handed. Determined not to let the crew down, the commander soon headed out again, hoping to find what they needed at a third settlement nearby. They loaded up the few furs that they had, along with a few of the bows which Tercio was now creating to practice his crafting, and the commander and Tavi set off north, towards the settlement of Evedenau. While the commander was away, a combat supplier's caravan approached the peninsula. Taking a short break from his crafting, Tercio went to trade with them. Being a combat supplier, they didn't have anything of great use to the crew for sale. However, they were happy to take a lot of the bows Tercio had crafted, and a number of the weapons they had taken from fallen raiders in exchange for some silver. Arriving at Evedenau, the commander was not able to source a skill trainer from them. However, they did have 6 whole advanced components, which the commander was able to buy with ease, thanks to their efforts in stockpiling what little silver they could. This wouldn't be enough to build the life support, but it would help them get a lot closer to building a functional ship. As bad news seems to follow bad, it would appear that good news also follows good, as shortly after returning from his trip with the advanced components in hand, the commander and Brom announced they were expecting a child. Finishing their research into basic ship sensors means that they now have all the research they need to build the ship. Jay moves on to another research project which would be nice to have, but might prove to be a little bit out of reach: artificial ecosystems. These are small, self-contained growth tanks which provide the water, sunlight, and nutrients that plants need to grow. Having them on the ship would be more efficient than building a sun lamp and separate hydroponics. Construction of artificial ecosystems would require yet more advanced components, however, so it was not incredibly likely that they'd be able to stock some in the ship in the next 30 days or so. Using the 6 advanced components the commander and Tavi brought back allowed Brom to build the basic sensors which the ship would need, but only just. This meant that they were still 12 advanced components away from being able to build life support, and even more to be able to build the last of the 2 solar panels to finish sealing in the hull. With the planet's remaining days becoming increasingly numbered, things were getting tense. But when the going gets tough, this crew gets going. Brom and the commander were both hard at work on the deep drills, pulling out steel and plasteel to stockpile for the build.
Soon the crew had 4 deep drills, 2 to extract plasteel and 2 to extract steel. If ever any of the crew found themselves with nothing else to do, they were instructed to start drilling. It was all hands on deck from now on. As the crew were busy working away on stockpiling their supplies, a raid of tribespeople approached. Armed with a mixture of guns and grenades, this raid could pose quite the threat to the crew. The raiders prepared for some time before attacking, however there was little the crew could do to prepare for the attack, so they settled for making sure they were well rested. As the raiders finally began their approach, the crew took up defensive positions along the sandbags and prepared for quite a bloody encounter. Thankfully, despite the raiders toting a number of guns, they largely seemed to have a shorter effective range than the crew's guns, allowing them to pepper a number of the raiders as they approached while receiving little fire in return. The addition of a personal shield to one of the raiders was a cause for concern, however, as there was only one, the crew figured that if they could take out enough of the unshielded attackers, then they may be able to cause the shielded one to flee out of fear. The first grenade came sailing over the sandbags, so the crew began to retreat. All except Brom, that is, who unfortunately had to stop to vomit due to morning sickness, and was immediately blinded by the stun grenade and then clipped with a bullet. Thankfully, shortly after this, the raiders had taken enough losses and turned tail, literally, and fled. This left the crew somewhat well off, all things considered, with only Brom and Kelsier suffering some minor damage. Following the raid, the Commander Gardener put his hauler mechanoid to work. As they had never had the time nor resources to spare to build a charging station for it, it had mostly laid dormant, conserving power. However, it was quite useful once every few weeks to clear the corpses from the trenches. The sight and smell of tens of corpses didn't seem to upset it like they did the squishy crewmates. It seemed that the vibrations of the incoming planet killer were starting to really upset the local bugs. They began to break through the surface right next to the base's main solar panels. Thankfully, the insectoids were easily distracted by the solar panels, allowing the Commander and Tavi to pick them off carefully one at a time, before they could do any real damage. Finally, on the 6th of September of the second year, almost half a year since he started, Tercio's montage finally came to an end. He would now be able to produce advanced components directly, allowing them to finally progress the ship further.
We return to find the crew buzzing with a new energy. Following Tercio's crafting montage, he's now capable of crafting advanced components for the crew, and wastes no time in getting into it. Collecting together some steel, plasteel and gold, he starts shaping them into the form they'll need. Given that creating advanced components requires these specific materials, this also means the crew will have a bit of a struggle, as these are also the materials that many other aspects of the ship will require too. With 10 advanced components crafted, they still don't have enough to create the incredibly complex life support system, which requires at least 12. For the time being, they use a couple of them to finish off the solar panels in the ship's hull, increasing its ability to generate power, and, finally, sealing in the hull to make it airtight. With some advanced components to spare, the Commander also finally designates a spot for a capacitor to store energy on the ship. He also designates an area for a heatsink to help vent any excess heat. Tercio crafts another batch of advanced components, bringing their current total up to 27. This is far and away the most components they've managed to gather up until this point. With no steel or plasteel left, the crew will need to mine fast. All the advanced components in the world mean nothing if you don't have any of the other materials you need. Determined to get the life support system up and running, after having waited so long for the materials, Brom chooses to ignore the heatsink for the time being, ensuring that all the steel and plasteel that is being mined goes straight to the life support system. As Brom works to finish the life support system, the Commander becomes a bit nervous at the possibility of her botching the construction and wasting some of their very limited resources. He elects to distract himself from this by planning other aspects of the ship. Once the life support and heatsink are operational, the ship will technically have everything it needs to take off, and keep the crew alive. However, it likely wouldn't keep them alive for very long, as it would be incredibly cramped with little to do and little storage space. There was a small chance they could reach another planet quickly, but it was much more likely that they would be on the ship for a little while, so the Commander wanted to make sure it was as livable as possible for them. Of course, expanding the ship would also mean expanding the perimeter wall to accommodate it. As the lights turned on the life support system, the crew gave a cheer. The ship was finally functional. The life support would supply oxygen, water, and waste recycling facilities to the crew while they were on board. As heat regulation was important on a ship, to ensure that no one either froze to death or was roasted alive, it was important that each room in the ship have a vent connected to a network of thermal conduits in the walls. Heaters in the rooms of the ship would produce heat. The vents control that temperature, releasing hot air in the room if it's too cold, or absorbing the heat if the room was too warm. They utilise the conduits in the walls to shuffle the heat around, and any excess heat is funneled to the heatsink to dissipate into the void of space. It's possible that the commander has a little thing for symmetry, and realising that his current plans for the ship would be asymmetrical, and not allow the solar panels on the new extension to match those on the first room, he began planning out how to expand the size just a little bit further.
As well as making things symmetrical, this plan would also increase the size of the second room, allowing for more storage or, perhaps, some additional pieces of equipment to help them survive the harsh environment of space. In order to construct the hull floor of the newly expanded second room, they first had to relocate the shelves to the outside of the ship. Building the floor beneath them simply wouldn't work. In an effort to utilise more of the materials they already had, Tercio suggested dismantling anything they no longer need, such as the chem fuel pump and refinery, one of the research benches, and even some of the static solar panels. With so many of the solar panels on the ship, they could start recycling some of the static ones without fear of running out of power. As the crew were working away on the third room of the ship, a large group of slavers, accompanied by a large number of war dogs, approached the base, intent on capturing some of the crew to sell later. The crew had experienced this all before, however, and took up their defensive positions with ease. Using more advanced weaponry than the slavers, they were able to make quick work of them. As the days passed, progress was being made on the third room, but not very quickly. They would still need to build the last few solar panels and the entire floor of the hull before the room was airtight. Using a deep drill was slow at the best of times, but as most of the crew lacked any real mining skills, it was painfully slow. Despite them focusing primarily on mining at the moment, there was still a large shortage of resources. Nevertheless, on the 2nd of December, the commander finished the last solar panel of the ship's outer hull. Once the floor of the hull was added to the third room, it would be complete, and the ship might actually have some space for the crew to exist, if only a little. In weeks gone by, Brom had worried that they would all be stuck together in the first tiny room of the ship, so she'd built some comfortable chairs in there as somewhere for them to rest and maybe sleep. But, now that they had the third room, she planned on moving them in there, along with one of the chessboards from the shared room of the shelter. This would allow them to have some form of recreation aboard the ship, just in case they were stuck there for a while. The spaces that the chairs had previously occupied couldn't fit much, so Tercio suggested adding a few more capacitors. He had this weird fear of running out of power and freezing to death in the small claustrophobic ship. I can't imagine why. Tavi was having a bit of a bad time and chose to direct his frustration and anger into insulting the rest of the crew. Unfortunately for him, however, he elected to insult the commander, who didn't take too kindly to the insubordination and proceeded to beat the shit out of Tavi, leaving him writhing in pain on the ground. Stupid decisions win stupid prizes, Tavi. The idea of recreation aboard the ship was one that sparked an interest in the commander. After the stress of their time on the planet, he was intent on making sure their time on the ship was as relaxing as possible. To that end, he moved the chairs and chessboard back into the first room to free up space for his new plan. With the hull of the third room almost finished, Kelsier took the chance to remind the commander that they would need basic hygiene facilities. Not wanting to admit that he had completely forgotten about this, the commander quickly outlined a tiny room to house a toilet, claiming that it had always definitely been part of the plan. The rest of his plan for the third room, however, was coming together nicely, as they worked to fill it with comfy armchairs and, the pièce de résistance, a full-sized pool table. This would serve as their recreation room, allowing the crew to finally unwind after their ordeal. However, it also served the purpose of making sure there were plenty of comfortable seats on the ship. And in an already crowded ship, beds would simply take up too much floor space in the already crowded ship, so sleeping in an armchair may be the best they can hope for, and it was certainly an improvement over the floor.
The ship was starting to look pretty good. It was still small and would undoubtedly prove to be a cramped space for 6 adults and soon to be 2 babies, but they would be able to take some supplies with them, have space to relax, and have all the necessities for survival, so things were looking a lot better than the initial worst case scenario they had planned for. On the 5th of December, Brom went into labour once more. This time, however, there was no tragedy in store, and in the early hours of the 6th, the crew welcomed the second baby into their ranks. Given that Tarsiel and Kelsier had never actually bothered to name their child, simply calling it the baby for the last few weeks, they finally elected to name her, to differentiate her from the new baby. Thus, their baby was named Vin Ancelstieri. A solar flare hit the base, which usually wasn't the biggest issue. However, the crew had failed to account for the fact that Vin was now old enough to wander around on her own and hadn't been outfitted with adequate clothes. Thus, without power for the heaters, and her propensity to wander outside in the freezing temperatures, the cold took one of Vin's toes and one of her fingers as payment for her hubris. After rearranging the shelves in the second room of the ship, they had space to place down some artificial ecosystems. They wouldn't be able to grow much, but they would allow the crew to grow some food or materials whilst in space, allowing them to survive for much longer up there, if required. The commander was giving thought to the issues they may encounter in space. He'd already decided that to outfit the ship with a shield or weaponry of its own was futile. They would never be able to hold their own in a fight. Given the small stature of the ship, however, they could always try and run. Their single engine would be more than enough to get them off the ground, but on the off chance that they might have to flee from an attacking ship, he directed them to add some more engines to the ship. The first road bump in the plan comes when the crew run out of food. They had been doing a great job of stockpiling packaged survival meals on the ship to take with them. But, with winter in full flow and a lack of animals on the peninsula to hunt, the crew were forced to start consuming the packaged meals before they'd even taken off. With 13 days to go until the planet was blown up, the crew were starting to get a little bit antsy, hoping that maybe the commander would just direct them to take off soon. The commander, however, was still concerned with how long it might take them to find a safe place to land. He was confident in his abilities as a pathfinder, but there simply might not be any other planetary bodies nearby, and as such, he wanted to make sure the ship could offer them as much as possible once they were up there. With that in mind, he began planning out one more room. Time was running dangerously low, but the commander was confident he could pull it off. As the commander was planning out the fourth room of the ship, however, the deep drowse of the crew angered a group of insectoids, causing them to burrow into the base to attack the crew. The crew did manage to defeat the insects without taking any injuries, but it did cost them some time, which currently was their most precious commodity. The crew tried to get back to work soon after the attack, but another was hot on its heels. A group from the Toxin Party had approached the peninsula. They had begun to hear rumours on their radios of the impending planetary destruction, and they wanted the crew's ship for themselves. To that end, they'd amassed as many of their people as they could to take one big swing at the crew. Their timing was quite unfortunate. Jay was having a mental break, Kelsier was already injured from a social fight, and, worst of all, in his haste to try and build the fourth room of the ship, the commander had broken his own rule and torn down a section of the defensive wall before the new section was complete, allowing a space where raiders could theoretically just waltz into the base, avoiding all of their defences. In a rare stroke of luck, however, the raiders didn't seem to notice the alternate entrance, and instead approached directly towards the defences at the front of the base. The crew took up their usual defensive positions and started blasting. A number of the raiders came equipped with guns, but the sandbags seemed to be doing their job well. That said, all of the crew did take at least one hit in the process, but they managed to mow down enough of the raiders to send the remainder running. With any luck, that'll be the last they see of the Toxin Party. The crew take a brief break to dress their wounds, but they can't rest. Everyone is back to work as soon as possible to try and finish the ship. Once they get on board, they can sleep for weeks if they want, but for the next 12 days, there is plenty of work that needs doing. The commander himself finishes construction on the second engine, giving him some peace of mind about their ability to escape from any other ships. As the commander has just begun work on the hull of the fourth room, a nearby goose attacks him. The whole planet really is out to get them at this point, but at least on this occasion, in doing so, it also provided them with some food.
As the build continues, steel begins to bottleneck the process. The commander suggests constructing another smelter, having deconstructed the last one in order to use its steel. He also suggests that they begin breaking down more of the equipment they won't be needing anymore, such as the static solar panels. It takes a few days for them to pull together enough steel to make the smelter. And, worst of all, once it's built, after days of waiting to amass the resources to do so, the commander realises he made a little bit of a mistake. He had used the wrong blueprint and accidentally built a smelter that requires wood to fuel it, as opposed to the electric smelter he had intended. The stress and burnout from all the hard work were really starting to get to the crew, and they were all close to their breaking point. The perfect time then for yet more insects to attack the base. With a resigned sigh, they all collected their weapons and prepared to slaughter more bugs. Without thinking properly, the commander asked Kelsier to join them for the fight. However, Kelsier was still badly injured and slow to move, meaning that she risked being caught by the insects, as the rest of the crew kited them backwards. Realising his mistake a bit too late, the commander demands that the rest of them hold their ground and try to distract the insects to allow Kelsier to escape. The plan does work, but unfortunately no one had warned Brom of the insects, and they ambush her as she tries to leave the ship. Angry and concerned for Brom, they rush in to destroy the last two Megaspectres. Along with a few pints of blood, Brom also lost an eye. Given how close they were to their goal, however, she would need to press on, but the crew's moods were definitely souring. With only 8 days to go, the fourth room was not even close to finished. The way things were going, the commander would soon need to make a decision on whether to abandon the project and just leave with what they had. But for now, they pressed on. With the additional steel from the smelter, they were soon able to get back to work on the walls of the hull. With just 6 days to go, they began putting down the floor of the fourth and undoubtedly final room of the ship.
The commander was beginning to falter.
He'd held the crew together for so long, but it was all getting a bit much. He suffered a bit of a mental break and went on a sad wander. Brom, however, was determined to do him proud and kept working away at the ship in his absence.
Brom's optimism soon snapped the commander out of his daze,
And with the dream team back in action, they made short work of the hull of the fourth room. This final room would add a level of luxury that they would never have dreamed of achieving for this flight. It added enough space for a stove, a table and chairs to eat at, and enough space for each colonist to have a bed, along with the standard furniture required to make them all feel comfortable. As this was the final countdown, they simply removed the furniture they needed from the shelter and moved it into the ship. Anything in the shelter that wouldn't be needed on the ship was salvaged for parts. There was no telling how the journey would go once they left the atmosphere, so the crew were determined to stockpile as many resources as they could aboard the ship before they left. They filled the shelves of the ship with any steel, plasteel, gold, or silver they could find. And they also stockpiled some Psychite tea for everyone's favourite little waster, Jay. With the limited storage space on the ship, and keen not to waste any of the incredibly hard-won resources they had accumulated, the commander directed Brom to add another engine to the ship. It would be a peppy little Spitfire with all 3 engines burning, and nothing would be able to catch up to them. He also directed her to build another artificial ecosystem, to provide them with more options. After the first night that the crew all spent sleeping inside the ship, it also produced its first harvest of rice. It was beginning to feel like a new member of the crew already. The commander used some of the space that the new room provided them to install a comms console. This would allow them to potentially trade with other ships while in space, giving them even more options for how to handle their time up there. As the final day rolled around, a group of traders from a nearby settlement approached the peninsula. Despite the lack of space on the ship, the crew tried to convince them to board it and leave with them, but there was no convincing them. They simply didn't believe it was possible to destroy an entire planet, and so elected to stay behind. Resigned to the fate of the traders, the crew spent the final day loading up the ship with as many things as they could carry. But the stress was beginning to get to them, and almost simultaneously, 4 of them ended up in a fistfight. But, despite the difficulties, 2 years after being left for dead on this doomed planet, the commander gathered his crew together to let them all share in the fruits of their labour. They'd done it. Through painstaking work and endless complications, they had managed to construct a spaceship of their own and launch it out of the atmosphere. Turning to view the planet, they were just in time to see the planet killer weapon land. Saddened and angered by the callous display of power that they had just witnessed, the commander turned to the ship's console and entered a new name for it. The ship would be christened the Arctis Minor. Turning to the crew with a grim look on his face, he proclaimed,
Meh, 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 meh.